everybody. Welcome to NAUI's Dive Team Report. I'm your host, Greg Martin. You know, whether or not you believe in climate change or whether or not big business, big farming, whatever is having a detrimental effect on the environment, you just cannot deny that our coral reefs have been dying off at alarming rates. And if you don't believe it, you should get yourself into some scuba gear and get down there and check it out. On a recent trip to the Bahamas, I was just struck by the damage of these once pristine coral reefs. Good news is that there's a devoted contingent of some great people out there working really hard to help revive those reefs. We have one of those with us today. Dr. David Vaughan is the executive director of the Mote, and if I say all this wrong, David, I know you'll correct me, the Mote Tropical Research Laboratory in Summerland Key, Florida. Also the manager of the Coral Restoration Program, also manages the Protect Our Reef Grants Program, and was recently highlighted by a very nice article with the American Association of Retired Persons, or AARP. David, welcome to the program.
Well, thanks, and you've got it all correct.
Well, how about that? Geez, and that's a kind of a long thing. Do you put that all in your business card?
Not all of it, but at least the first two, being executive director of the lab, but also the manager of the Coral Restoration Program, which is what most people are excited about. Not as much about my administration of a Protect Our Reef Grants Program, unless you're one of those to get the grant.
Absolutely. There are a lot of people out there that have taken this project on of helping to save coral reefs. What brought you to it in the first place?
Well, that's a kind of a long story. I actually got started as a youngster in as many did that are scuba divers, as being enthralled with things such as marine sciences. Most of us grew up watching the TV show, The Underwater World of Jacques Cousteau, and just being enamored of this undersea world that we could learn how to snorkel and then scuba dive, to each be an explorer. And so I was, as a youngster, very enamored and wanting to be a marine biologist at an early age, literally between 9 and 11, so much so that I kept asking my parents if I could get certified to scuba dive. And this was in the early 60s, in which, as most people know, there weren't too many places that would look kindly on an 11 or 13-year-old being certified for this new technology of scuba.
Right.
But I finally went from place to place after my parents saw me melting my lead toy soldiers, cowboys, and Indian figurines into scuba weights. And they figured that it was hopeless trying to think I was going to grow out of this phase. So they took me from place to place until we finally found an instructor. And he said, I'll tell you what, I'll put him in the pool. And, if he can make it through what I'll put him through, I'll take him, thinking that I would never do it. Because at 13 years old, I was only 4'11" and 83 pounds. And he did the typical Don doffing, ripping my mask off, spinning me around. And at 83 pounds, I looked like a baton being spun around the water. And after 20 minutes, he gave up. And I said, okay, you can make the class. And so I was one of the earlier youngest divers in my region, and got the chance to go actually on an expedition for corals to the Virgin Islands.
Nice.
Which, after you had just mentioned that, for those of us who have seen some of the tropical places from the Caribbean and the Bahamas in the 60s and 70s, are one of the ones that really have a different baseline to compare today's coral reefs. And so, to make a long story short, I got to do my first expedition in 1966 to look at corals for the potential location of the laboratory that Fairleigh Dickinson University had as their first marine station, called the West Indies Laboratory. And actually, my job was to take a hammer and a chisel and knock off big live pieces of elkhorn and other corals and put them in a formalin jar to send back to the university for study. And I tell people that, 50 years later, here I am now growing coral and putting it back on the reef. So I'm making up for those types of times where the where the tools of the trade were something that was more destructive than we'd ever think about today.
We didn't think about it back then either. It was nothing for us to go on a dive trip and run across a nice piece of elkhorn or whatever it happened to be, and break off a piece and take it home to the kiddies. Here, look at what Daddy and Mommy did while they were on vacation, and we just didn't think about it back then. But you recently kind of, you're in that mode of I'm getting ready to retire, where we're all starting to get a little older. Some of us a little older than others, but you kind of had an aha moment here recently, didn't you?
That's correct. Yes, I actually counsel a number of children and want to know what it takes to be a marine biologist, and I tell them that I actually started with corals, moved on to working with seagrasses, and then with algae, and then I moved from there to clams and to oysters and to growing different marine organisms in aquaculture, and finally came back to actually growing marine ornamentals for the aquarium trade, and stumbled upon some ways to grow corals for restoration. So as I tell some of my youngsters that want to be a marine biologist, is that I still haven't figured out what I want to be when I grow up. So you don't have to worry about making a decision of any one career. If you like working underwater and can have nowadays a decent amount of technology types of jobs in that area, one of which I think is going to be a developing trend from what we're discovering now is techniques to actually grow corals and plant them back on the reef. We call it reef restoration. And it's very similar to what we all grew up with in reforestation. We take it for granted that if something happens to a forest, or if you want to grow paper mill from a forest, you can grow trees from seedlings and plant them right back. You don't have to wait hundreds of years for it to maybe happen over time. And now we actually have the capabilities in hand that is being developed to be able to regrow coral and put it out there. And yes, my first advancement with this was from what the New York Times called my eureka mistake. So It was by accident.
Well, what happened? What was the accident?
Well, we first started growing corals almost 15 years ago, and it was really more of a desperation mode. It was a mode in which we thought that most of the corals around the world were being lost to high temperatures, and most people who have an aquarium or a reef tank in their house know that you don't change the water temperature much. You have to keep it steady. But regretfully, we've been changing the ocean's temperatures higher and lower in a one that the corals are just not liking it and would have to take thousands of years to evolve to be able to tolerate those conditions. So we actually moved corals indoors into tanks to what I call the coral gene bank. And it was basically just like what a zoo or a public aquarium would do, of having some threatened or endangered species in captivity. So if they did, heaven forbid, go extinct in the wild, we'd at least have some live organisms and tissue in place. But what we found is we could actually grow some of them a little faster under good controlled temperatures than in the wild. And then I looked to be able to try and see if we could grow some from the typical way that most aquaculturists would grow a salmon or a hatchery-raised oyster or clam or shrimp, is to look for the sexual cycle of these animals and try to get millions of eggs, bring them back into the laboratory, and instead of only one out of a million making it, get a few more. And we were successful the first time with the big elkhorn coral. And we collected 1 million eggs, and we got 11 to make it. And that didn't sound like much, but I was knowing that we would improve that percentage, which we have done so far the past few years, up to getting 1,000 or so to make it. But back 10 years ago, those 11 at 1 year old were somewhere in between the size of the head of a pin and a pencil eraser. And so I got really worried that this growth rate from sexual coral babies, basically, was just too small and too slow. And hence, by 2 years old, they were only the size of a nickel or a dime. And then by 3 years old, the size of only a quarter to a silver dollar. And so literally I got disappointed that this was too slow. So I took them off the top rung of the aquarium tank and I put them on the bottom of the tank thinking that this was no longer a viable method to be wasting my time with. Well, 6 months later, I went to move those corals off the bottom of the tank to clean the tank, and one of them stuck, and I didn't realize it had grown and attached itself to the bottom of the aquarium, and when I pulled it, it broke. And it broke into little tiny pieces that I thought was never going to be any help. And in fact, it was going to be stressful for the coral to even live. But that's not what happened. What happened was these little tiny pieces of coral that were broken grew super fast back to the original size of about the size of a quarter in just a few weeks to a few months instead of a few years.
No kidding. So
something happens to these corals that when they're broken into little pieces, they want to heal and grow back really fast. And so the analogy I sometimes give is like your skin. Everybody knows that your skin does not grow very fast, or it'd be hanging down on the sidewalk as you walk down the street, and you'd look pretty silly. But if you fell on that sidewalk, like I did as a child, and got a nice quarter-sized piece of the skin out of my elbow or my knee, what happens is that skin all of a sudden scabs over and grows back in just a week or two. And that's similar to what the coral is doing. So what we have done is applied that technique to all 28 species of hard corals here in the Florida Keys. And instead of taking years to produce 100 or a few hundred corals, we literally can cut 1,000 corals in one day, and they're up and ready in size to be planted in as little as 3 to 6 months.
Fascinating.
So it is a game changer for corals, and that's the good news.
And it's basically by destroying a coral, and what you'd think would be destroying a coral, that made this whole thing happen.
Well, yes, but I want to be perfectly clear for people going out to think that, we need to just smash coral into small pieces and it actually will help them. This is more like a hospital-type indoor laboratory operation.
Sure.
We basically have a very fine tools in which we cut one single polyp at a time and remount it onto a new growth area. This is not something people should think they should take the same hammer I used 50 years ago to take and collect a piece of coral to smash or break corals into small pieces, that it's a benefit.
And this is going to be a game changer. I can just see it. We're going to get our pristine corals back because of people like you, David.
Well, I'm very hopeful too, and there's been literally hundreds of coral biologists around the world that were getting fairly depressed on seeing how bad things are getting, but this is a ray of hope. This is really being able to do the same thing that we've done on land with trees or with mangroves or dune grasses or wetland species and replant them. And it's working. So I'm very hopeful for the future. I'm very hopeful that divers will get involved in helping out on this process, because we'll need a lot of people in the water to help carry this out for now. And it's actually very rewarding planting a coral and going back later and seeing it starting to grow and thinking that we've taken so much from enjoying the oceans before. It's time for us to put something back and give back.
Echo every bit of what you just said, and I urge everybody out there to check out the website, mote.org, mote.org. You can get in there and do a little search on there, and you can find Dr. David Vaughan and his coral reef restoration. Check out the video that from AARP. Give you a little background on David and his aha moment here. And gosh, all the best with this project. I know you guys are working on other things at Mote, sea turtle nesting and a lot of other things, but this is one of those big ones that we as divers, when we see it, we want to see those reefs back. And good on you for what you're doing there, David.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. I've been very blessed over my career and being able to see and experience the underwater world. It's time, and I'm really enjoying being able to give something back and show people the right way forward, and we can save this beautiful underwater Garden of Eden that we've had.
David, thank you so much for your time and for joining us, and by all means, best of luck with everything for that.
Well, thank you very much for having me on.
And if you have questions, be sure, again, check out mote.org, mote.org, or if you'd like to find more about diving, check out NAUI.org, NAUI.org. That's going to wrap it up for this episode of NAUI's Dive Team Report. I'm stoked. I think this is exciting. This is Greg Martin. I will see you underwater.